So my name's Tom Stanton. I'm going to be talking to you today about my work with communities in the environmental research space. I am I'm on the wrong screen. That's what I am. There we go. I'm a lecturer in geography at Loughborough University. Very deliberately a lecturer in geography. When I was asked what I wanted my job title to be, I was told typically people go for lecturer in physical geography or human geography, and I said, well, I'm both. So very, very deliberately a lecturer in geography. I'm a co-investigator on the Impact Plus bid, and I've got a diverse research interest, but mostly focusing around pollution in aquatic spaces, and kind of how we can better understand pollution by integrating different knowledges outside of the environmental discipline. So related to that, I am the principal investigator on a number of community integrated research projects. Some of those are on screen now. I'm going to talk a little bit about the projects themselves, but most of what today's talk is going to be about is more around my experiences working in this space rather than actually the findings of these particular projects. Before I start though, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So when I talk about myself as an interdisciplinary environmental researcher, I want to make sure that we all know what I mean by interdisciplinary, and I appreciate there are lots of different definitions in this space. So I'm not talking about someone who works with multiple disciplines in disciplinary silos to get to a common goal. I'm not talking about research that has kind of linkages between disciplines, again, towards a common goal. I'm talking about research that actually takes me out of my comfort zone, undertaking research that is not my kind of home discipline, but also welcomes colleagues from other disciplines into my research space and teaches them my techniques to basically share the perspectives behind what we do and why we do it, so that we can hopefully diversify our interpretation of each other's data. And what I found has been really, really nice about this kind of approach and this definition of interdisciplinary is it opens up new ways of interpreting stuff that I certainly have taken for granted because it's just a methodological approach or in a way to evaluate data that is just because it's just something I've been taught to do and not question. Bringing in these different disciplinary perspectives in this particular way has really challenged that and actually opened up a lot of creative ways to kind of navigate disciplinary challenges that have either not been expected or that have been particularly hard to overcome by sitting in my own disciplinary silo. So that's what I mean by interdisciplinary. I also just want to clarify something about my definition of communities here. The title of this talk is not focused on communities as members of the public or public groups. I'm thinking about communities of place, of circumstance, interest, practice, and action, and many, many more besides. This differentiation makes sure that my definition of community also includes the academy. Okay, we are all sitting within communities of practice. Different disciplinary boundaries are communities in and of themselves. And so integrating communities into my research does have a big focus on doing that with members of the public, but it's also about opening doors to people who I wouldn't ordinarily collaborate with. What I am going to do in this talk is outline my involvement with these different communities and summarize some of my experiences in this space and ultimately reflect on why I think this is so important and what I've got from doing this, particularly over the last sort of 2 to 3 years. What I'm not going to do, as I mentioned earlier, is dwell too much on the specific details of the research. There's 2 reasons for that. I'm going to be using 2 case studies. One of them is hopefully in the next few weeks going to be published. It's in the final stages of review, very positive reviews as well. The other one is about to be submitted, so I don't want to give too much away before that particular paper is submitted for review. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the Restoring Riverscapes project. So this was actually led out of Keele University, some colleagues at Keele. I was brought in as an environmental textile fibre specialist on it as part of my AXA research fund fellowship. Before I go into too much detail, I just want to flag a couple of kind of key background points. First one there is that natural textile fibers, so these are fibers that are cotton and wool, for example, they're not petrochemical based, have been found to dominate contemporary environmental samples when microplastic researchers have gone looking for them. I recall an earlier presentation in this webinar where in the comments people were talking about how this was new knowledge. I actually would disagree with that. We've been working in this sort of space since 2019, and people have started, environmental scientists started questioning the potential harm of these non-plastic textile fibers in 2015. So this is not really new knowledge. It's definitely emerging. It's a smaller body of literature. But there are a lot of people who are looking for natural fibers, and then when they stumble across them, are reporting it as new novel findings. I also want to stress that this is not new knowledge outside of the environmental sciences. So if you go into the forensic science literature, this observation has been reported since the 70s. Where people have looked at these natural textile fibers in the environment and considered what potential harm there could be, environmental or toxicological impacts have been observed and have been reported to be either similar or even greater than plastic textile fibers. What I really want to stress here, though, is that some of those pieces of work have actually misrepresented the fibers that they are reporting. So they've talked about the environmental harm of natural textile fibers when they've been looking at regenerated textile fibers, for example, which is a sort of grey area between natural and petrochemical derived. So there's a real issue in terminology. I want to flag here that in this case study and in the case study that follows, I am going to be challenging some of the established literature. I'm not directing specifically to papers when I do that, because I don't think that's fair. Those authors are not here to kind of defend themselves, and it's not really that's not the point of what I'm saying. It's recognizing that there are some misconceptions in these spaces that need to be addressed and that kind of have motivated this work. So aligned to that, I also just want to touch on biodegradation. So there's a lot of work that has been published looking at biodegradation of natural textile fibers that has reported complete biodegradation of textile fibers as well. And a lot of this has not taken place in environmentally representative conditions, or has followed ISO standards for biodegradation, which are not representative of the environments that these fibers are actually found in. But there's also some real disciplinary misunderstanding in some of this literature about the difference between degradation and biodegradation, where we have people placing swatches of natural fibered garments into the environment, leaving them for a period of time and observing that they are no longer there, and assuming that this is some sort of biodegradation, without recognizing that actually most natural textile fibers will be woven into staple yarns, and therefore over time, with the agitation that they'll be exposed to in the environment, they could just disintegrate. So fiber degradation studies that aren't looking around the sample site, or the site that the sample was introduced to see if they've got lots of small bits of textile fiber there that have just disintegrated or sort of mechanically degraded from the initial swatch. So this opens up some real problems with the narratives around natural textile fibers in sustainable fashion if it's being based on assumptions or misinterpretations that span disciplinary divides. And that's what kind of really motivated this particular piece of work. So the research question for our Restoring Riverscapes project, which fell under my Unnatural Naturals fellowship, I was thinking about whether or not these natural textile fibers in the right environment could be preserved in the sediment record as technofossils. If you don't know what technofossils are, they are materials associated with anthropogenic activity that are preserved in environmental archives, so they can kind of give a window into the past of society. This particular research question required integration of pollution and paleolimnology, environmental science disciplines, forensic science methods for the identification of textile fibers, working with historians, local historians, to understand the kind of the landscape that the ultimate sample site kind of sat in, people who actually worked in these industries as well, the textile industries in this area, and those who have got lived experience of the environment that we ultimately ended up studying. So by combining these different methodologies, and one of my favorite sort of research activities that I've ever really undertaken, which was just scanning really old maps, I narrowed down a few potential sites that we could do it. And this, if you don't know this area, this is a close-up of Danebridge from the 1840s, I think. And Danebridge sits in Staffordshire, on the Staffordshire-Cheshire kind of border. What you might be able to just make out here is the words Colour Mill, Mill Pond. I think that's just it there. But these are locations of textile activity that took place during the UK's second industrial revolution. Around Danebridge, there are over 10 particular sites that are associated with the textile industry. And downstream of this particular site is a reservoir, a human-made lake called Rudyard Lake. So by combining these different methodologies, we identified Rudyard Lake as a potential site where we might actually be able to take a sediment core and look at the preservation of textile fibres in said sediment core. In this sense, we're really thinking about communities as those disciplinary communities. So what do we actually do? We use these archival methods to identify suitable sites, use paleolimnological techniques to recover sediment core, date the sediment core, and isolate the textile fibres. As I've mentioned, and I've just realised I forgot to put this bullet point on, we used forensic science methodologies to then identify the textile fibres that we found. And then we did what we are referring to as community social science with Staffordshire residents to explore local textile history. So this was taking members of the Staffordshire community who were interested to local archives and pouring through old archives, whether it was maps, newspapers, pamphlets, whatever we found, to kind of pull out the relevant time-based and space-based information that could help us interpret any potential findings that we might actually get when we looked at the textile fibres in our sediment core. And what we also did was interviewed local residents. Some of these actually worked in the textile industry. So there was one gentleman who worked in these in the local dyeing industry into the mid 1900s. So I think it was 1960s was when he was working there. Still alive today, and was able to tell us his experiences of the story. There was also a local resident near to the lake who was able to talk to us about the way that the reservoir itself was fed and how that particular channel was managed and maintained through the years, and ultimately when it fell into disrepair. So with these particular communities, we were able to gain that kind of lived experience, that local knowledge that ultimately ended up underpinning our interpretation of the data that we collected. I said I'm not going to go into too much detail about the findings of these case studies that I'm presenting, but I do just want to share this graph with you here. So this is a graph of our sediment core, the oldest sediment at the bottom dating to around about 1879, and then the most recent sediment up at 2022 when the core was collected. And what you can see is that natural textile fibres dominated this sediment core. Now they were present all the way back to that oldest sample from 1879. We also see changes in at particular time points. So around the 1970s, here, this black line, we see a rapid increase in fibres. Now there's lots of different reasons why this might be, but what we do know from our social science interviews is that there was some work being done upstream at this point in time. So there was the demolition of an old mill occurred in the late 1970s, potential influx of fibres as a result of that, for example. What I want to stress here is that we went in with an environmental science question. We recognised that there were academic disciplinary gaps that we needed to fill, and we worked with the relevant kind of disciplinary colleagues. And working with different academic communities is, we do share quite a bit of language, so that was perhaps a little bit easier. But what we got the most from when it came to actually integrating this kind of community approach was actually from the public communities who shared this knowledge that we're not privileged to have in our academic space. We can't just assume that we understand the spatial environment that we were working in. And without this, we would have actually struggled to interpret some of the changes in the data that we saw, but we also wouldn't necessarily have been asking the right questions because we were just purely focused at the very start on, are there textile fibres in the lake sediment? So it really opened up doors for us. And this is in review currently at iScience, a Cell Press journal. So that the I in iScience stands for interdisciplinary. I will say as well, it's been a really positive review process. So if you've got anything working in this, any work that might be in this space, I would definitely recommend them as a target journal. Watch this space on that front. So that's my first case study. The second case study I want to talk about is my research looking at marine litter on the west coast of Scotland. So this currently falls under 4 projects. So 50 Years of Litter on Skye and Siúbhal a Chadach, the two at the top there, have concluded, but they have led into the work that's going on now. So that includes my Isle of Skye project funded by the Royal Society and Karma funded by the Ecological Citizens Network Plus. Again, a bit of background before I go into the detail. So in Europe, the Loughborough Commission lead beach litter monitoring. So this is a multinational commission that have set a standard methodology for the surveying of marine litter on beaches. It's not the only European method that's out there. This is also done by, for example, Helcom is another organisation that deal with the Scandinavian coastline. And they set standard expectations of the types of beaches and the ways that people undergo their surveys. However, for both of these data sets, or well, for all European level monitoring of beach litter, there are large stretches of coastline that just have no data. And this is because of the natural and the social environments that exist along these coastlines that make it really difficult to get data to feed into European level monitoring. There have been attempts in the literature to model beach litter on the west coast of Scotland. Some of this has relied on assumptions that have not been ground truth and have actually caused quite a bit of tension with local communities. And these connections that community groups have to the shoreline are entrenched in their local heritage on the west coast of Scotland. You may have heard of beach combing. This is a practice that dates back to way before the materials on the beaches were plastic. It's still going on. It's still a fundamental part of west coast of Scotland culture. The materials have changed, but the ability to go out and find value in materials that are washing up on beaches is still very much there. However, at the same time, the materials that are washing up are appearing in much greater number and obviously have a lot more sinister consequences than the driftwood etc. that was washing up in the pre-1950s really. And the first academic study to make this connection between the litter that is on beaches and litter that is floating at sea was published on the west coast of Scotland in 1972. So that was Gerald Scott. 2 things to note there. Firstly, I've underlined the word academic here. People living on these coastlines don't need an academic to come and tell them that litter comes from the sea. However, it is the first academic record that I've certainly been able to come across. I said 2 things to note there, and I can't remember what the other one was, so I'll just just move on. So, 50 Years of Litter on Skye is the project that kind of started all of this work. And initially, I wanted to go to Skye to think about how much litter is on Skye's beaches now and how it's changed since 1972. So again, very environmental science focused question. But to do this, I realised that I needed to actually have some conversations with people on the coastline to work out where best to sample and basically organise the logistics of the trip. So for 6 months from the project start to our first field season, I went through a phase of the project that I now refer to as from teams to transect. And what these conversations showed me really quickly, and I'm talking about within the first meeting that I had, was that beach litter on the west coast of Scotland, and at the start particularly on Skye, is a real contentious issue. It is causing a lot of problems socially, environmentally, industrially on this stretch of shoreline. And there are massive knowledge gaps within the academic literature, but there is not an absence of academic interest within the communities that I was speaking to, or the community groups that I was speaking to. And here at the start, I am talking about communities in the kind of members of the public sense. So what I want to stress there is that people who are living with these environmental, I don't think I'm understating it to say environmental catastrophes, and I think you'll see in a few slides' time why I'm using that particular word. There's not a lack of inquiry within those communities, but they're not resourced to explore those questions. So very quickly, in this From Teams to Transnects part of the project, my focus flipped from not worrying about how much beach litter there is on Skye shorelines, and I was more focused with making sure that my research team could answer the questions that were pertinent to the communities that were ultimately going to be supporting us. So we started thinking about what the research community itself does not currently know about marine litter, highlighting the gaps that had been flagged. And I will stress here, these are people who can read scientific papers and do read scientific papers. They are people who have got environmental backgrounds or are currently working in the environmental space. So they know what we're talking about, and they told me where we're going wrong. And then start thinking about what questions we should actually be asking. So I talked a little bit about the big gaps in data that are present within international monitoring or European level monitoring of marine litter. But why is it so important on the west coast of Scotland? So the UK sits within OSPAR's remit. So European level monitoring that concerns Scotland and the UK will be done by OSPAR. And there are large swathes of coastline that are just simply not monitored. A big part of, one of the biggest parts of this is Scotland as a whole, not just the west coast. So you can see here, this is, all of these points are maps, are locations of OSPAR survey sites from their 2022 published monitoring programme. That's the most recent data that I found available to me. And you can see west coast of Scotland as well as the east coast. There's 2 or 3 sampling sites, and they are very much at the southern end of that reach. Another big stretch of coastline that's not covered is the west coast of Norway, and also the south, east and north really of Iceland as well. So Scotland is one of these parts of Europe that has a lot of marine litter, but very little monitoring going on. And when I say a lot of marine litter, when I talk about this as an environmental catastrophe, I really don't think I'm overstating it. The year 2022, the distribution of dots there, and this is sort of scaled so that you can compare directly. The average pieces of litter, the UK shoreline, as reported by the Marine Conservation Society, was 309 pieces of litter per 100 metres. The European target, by the way, is 20 pieces of litter per 100 metres. In our first survey year, we reported an average of 3,751 pieces of litter per 100 metres. And we didn't just go to really bad beaches there. There was one stretch of coastline where we were only able to survey 30 metres of it, I think, and we only found 40 pieces of litter. So, this is that's very much at the lower unpolluted end of beaches on Skye, but still higher than the European target. But it gets even worse, because at some of the sites there was so much litter that we could not even begin to quantify it using the methodologies that are feeding into this OSPAR monitoring program. And this is something that we were told by the local community. So we had to kind of break it down even further. Most of our surveys were conducted on 10-metre wide sections of beach, not 100-metre wide sections of beach. The data here are if we extrapolate up. The reason for that is that some of the beaches we were looking at were just, you couldn't start. You really couldn't even start to make a dent if you're going to try and do 100 metres of beach. One of those beaches here, this is a photograph from Camasunary, where we did a 1 by 1 metre square quadrat. We just removed the litter from the surface. You can see the before and after here, and we found 1,051 pieces of litter in that 1 metre square. That's the level of litter that are on some of these shorelines for which there is zero monitoring data feeding in to European level monitoring. Really important that we stress here that that's European level monitoring. The Marine Conservation Society are doing some amazing work to try and fill that data gap, but they can only feed it into UK policymakers. It's not eligible for consideration at the OSPAR level. So we have a really, really big problem here, a massive environmental issue, communities that are extremely knowledgeable and have lived experiences that are, we can't even, as an academic community, cannot even begin to think about trying to get our head around unless we've actually come from these communities ourselves. But we are in a position where the published literature is presenting the problem in a manner that is not either representative of the experiences of community members, or is in some cases quite dismissive of it as well. So off the back of that 50 Years of Litter and Sky project, I got a little bit more funding to expand these findings. So we started working with another community group on the Kintyre Peninsula in the lovely little village of Tarbert. We built closer ties with some of the groups on the west coast of Scotland. So that includes the Skye and Lookout Environment Forum, the Slate Community Trust, and the University of Highlands and Islands Gaelic College, Savilmore, Ostave as well, to kind of understand that long-standing heritage of marine litter in this space. And essentially, it just helped to strengthen our own data set. And we did this in two ways. We had another field season. I stand corrected. We had another 2 field seasons from this grant, where we could generate more data to kind of explore and pick what some of these challenges are, but also how there might be opportunities to extend monitoring within the OSPAR remit if OSPAR were receptive to slightly modifying their methodology. We also did that. We also generated additional data by resourcing some of the community groups who had kind of facilitated the work that we did in our own field seasons. So each of our field seasons is 2 weeks over summer. You can't get loads of or a really in-depth picture in that space over that time. So we resourced, and when I say resource, we've provided training materials, equipment, and finances to 2 community groups to undertake additional surveys associated with this project, basically recognizing the amount of time and the costs associated with undertaking beach cleans at some of these places. What we found when we kind of gave ourselves that bit more field time to really get into the nitty-gritty of the scientific challenges are associated with the methodology, but also to engage more with these community groups, is that unequivocally the established research data and monitoring data is not accurate when people try and apply it to heavily polluted coastlines like this. There's a lot of data that are missing. Part of this is just because it's not practical to implement the methodology that is expected of particularly volunteer communities. And I'll just stress here that for a lot of countries that are undertaking OSPAR monitoring, they are having their beaches monitored by paid members of staff. In the UK, it is volunteer-led. It is coordinated by the Marine Conservation Society, who organise beach cleans for volunteers to attend. So what that means is that, you know, if you've got people who are not being paid to turn up, and I am not lying here when I say that there are people who have spent 24 hours on a beach on Skye and not cleared it, you're not going to be able to get people generating the data needed to actually understand what the reality of litter on this coastline is if you don't resource it. This results in misleading data. One of the key types of data that are missing are regionally specific types of data that are othered, or types of litter, sorry, that are othered. If you don't have that local knowledge, if you don't have people who are walking these beaches multiple times a week being able to say, I know exactly where that piece of plastic is coming from, you can't identify the appropriate intervention point. So there's lots of types of litter that just go into general plastic categories that with local input you can go a long way to working out where the plastic is coming from and therefore how to get it out of the environment. And some really quite disheartening kind of engagements with legislators, policymakers, and researchers kind of came out of this particular phase of the study, and I'm going to touch on them in a few slides time, that demonstrate that the current approach to monitoring beach litter is really being, in many ways, is quite disrespectful to the people who are on the ground in the west coast of Scotland, working so hard to clear litter, but also who hold so much knowledge if we actually want to make meaningful changes in this space. So off the back or associated with this, and really aligned with this idea of a long history of beach combing, I wanted to think about how I could try and communicate some of this work to people who are not in a privileged position to be able to actually visit these sites. And I was awarded a small grant from the Royal Society for a project called Isle of Skye. Now, the title Isle of Skye, that pun, was kind of born out of me being asked, what do I actually want to do with the information? How do I want to tell people about the work that we're doing who are not in the academy? And I said, well, really what I want to do is take a skip of litter from Skye, dump it in the Sainsbury's car park, and then put little tags on it saying this is coming from aisle 7, this is associated with items that can be found on aisle 11, and so on and so on. And then it just sort of organically came to me that, and I want this project to be called Isle of Skye, but with like a supermarket aisle. And through Isle of Skye, I was connected, or I reached out to a chap called Simon Riddle. So Simon is a wet plate collodion photographer. Wet plate collodion photography is a technique that they used in Victorian times. Basically, the really long exposures, you can't blink, otherwise the photo goes blurry. That kind of method of photography. And it really spoke to me because this practice of beach combing, the phrase Trefoil cladat, which translates from Gaelic to traversing the shore, is heavily referenced and rooted in Victorian time literature from the Victorian times. Obviously, the practice predates that by some way. So I thought it would be really nice, quite circular, to be able to use a Victorian method of photography to communicate a practice that is rooted in heritage, but in which the materials have changed over time. So Simon was commissioned to undertake a series of photographs of the problem, which we're currently working with the conversation to get them in a conversation article. We're hoping that we'll be able to present them at Holyrood. We've got interest from an MSP, but because there's elections next year, we're kind of having to wait to see if they return to Parliament before we can go through with that idea. And then there's various other ways that we can hopefully share the images. But I'm going to share the images with you here now. So this is a photograph of me on the beach on the Elgol Peninsula. So this is one of the sites that was surveyed in that 1972 piece of work that kind of started my interest in this space. And behind me is that beach camasoonery where we found the 1,051 pieces of litter in 1 metre squared. This is a photograph of some of our team. Really just want to kind of highlight the team effort that has gone on in this work. This is a close-up of some of that work, looking at small bits of litter in quadrats. And I should say, actually, these photos all have names. So this top one is Trefoil cladat, traversing the shore. It's me going back. The one below is we, just really stressing that this is a team effort. This photo is called "The Closer You Look." The idea being that we literally have spent hours, 2 to 3 hours cleaning 1 metre squared worth of beach. Such are the numbers. This is a photograph of us undertaking some of the survey work, and I'm going to come back to that one. And then finally, this photograph is called "Bound and Laid to Waste." It's a sperm whale that washed up on the shore of Rasay. So that's a small island in between Skye and the mainland, with 15 kilograms of plastic in its stomach and 132 meters of fishing rope around its jaw. 132 meters is longer than the length of a football pitch, for reference. So that's kind of the ultimate fate and reason why this marine litter is causing such a problem. And I do want to just come back to this photo here. This photo is called "You Can't Teach This." This is my team undertaking, obviously very much a staged, but still undertaking a survey methodology that it's a standard environmental survey. method. But the only reason we thought to apply it was through the conversations that we had with the people who are working in this space and who, on the ground, the members of the public, the people who are asking us how they can best understand this litter and generate data that is going to be accepted by people in Holyrood, people in Westminster, people in Brussels. Whilst they haven't actually suggested coming up with this particular method, it is their conversations about what they need that has led us to explore this alongside several other methodologies to try and work out what might be a better way, to generate data where there's currently such a dearth, but also such a need. So that's why it's kind of, I've framed this as you can't teach this, because I think it's really important that we as academics recognize that we're privileged in the knowledge that we hold, and we certainly know a lot, but we absolutely cannot assume that we know everything. Okay, we need to listen to people outside of our own discipline, whether that is still within the academy or particularly, I think, in environmental issues, people who are living with the challenges that we are exploring and thinking about these natural environments alongside their social environmental contexts as well. And so this has led us on to the project that I'm leading now called CARMA. It's Community Anthropogenic Litter Monitoring with Ecological Citizen Researchers. So this is going through some of these alternative methodologies to think about how we might be able to fill some of these data gaps. Crucially, though, we are undertaking surveys as researchers, as environmental scientists, to essentially assess different methodological approaches empirically from the monitoring point of view. But we're also resourcing, and again, we're paying the community supporters that we're involved with to do this, people on the ground to undertake the same surveys in our absence, partly so that we can get a bit more data, so that we have more of an evidence base on which to make any recommendations that come from it, but also to consider the social requirements or expectations of the different methodologies. So not only are they going to be collecting data for us, but they're also going to be writing reports that tell us essentially what works and what doesn't work. Because there's no point in us coming at this from a data perspective and saying there's no statistical difference between these two different methodologies, but one of them takes a third of the time of the other, if that alternative methodology puts a big or unreasonable demand on the people who ultimately will be required to implement it, to generate data to feed into policy. As I say, in the UK, this is led by volunteer efforts coordinated by the Marine Conservation Society. So think about the practicality of those methods as well as their scientific rigor. But we also want to reflect on what these community groups need to sustain their current efforts. It's been made very clear in a lot of Scottish policy documents or decisions recently that the monitoring of marine litter is something that they are not as inclined to support as they have been in previous years. So it's putting more of a responsibility, if we're actually going to address this problem, on those volunteer communities. What do they actually need if they're wanting to sustain these efforts? A lot of people, for example, are operating on a select number of beaches that are close to their hearts and close to their homes, but there are large swathes of coastline that are therefore being completely untouched. How can we kind of support them to expand the work that they're doing? Because we do know from our conversations that they would love to do more if they had the resources for it. And then finally, how can we best communicate the environmental reality of these issues to the players who are geographically removed? So whether that's members of the public who have the potential to, if they're able, make more informed decisions, whether it's people in Westminster or Holyrood who are not associated, their constituents don't lie on these affected shorelines, or even further afield. You know, we're finding litter on this shoreline that we can easily trace back to the eastern seaboard of North America, all the way from Nova Scotia down to Florida. We've been able to trace litter. What we're also doing though is starting to bring this together for publication. So we've got 2 years worth of data that we've analysed in multiple different ways. What we basically found is that OSPAR is not working. We recognise that OSPAR has its place, but there is a clear need, if OSPAR is actually going to be representative of European shorelines, for the methods to be reconsidered, not necessarily just to accommodate Scottish coastlines, but also involving communities from the other underrepresented shorelines that fall within its geographical remit. In this paper, we talk a lot about our engagement with the communities that have supported our work. And so what we have actually written into our paper as a methodology with associated results and discussion section is a community peer review. We have sent our manuscripts to review by the community members. We've got 6 responses, I think, or 5 or 6 responses. So more than we would expect from an academic peer review, to basically sense check the quality of the work that we have presented, but also how accurately we have reported our engagement, and also both the natural and the social environments that are core to this particular work. And what we've found is that this process has acted just like a academic peer review. We didn't necessarily get any typical reviewer twos, but we did have really constructive criticisms, things that were flagged that had we not gone to the community beforehand, would have risked being published and not being accurately representative of either the place or the people who we engage with. So it was a really, really important exercise. And I've not seen this done before. I'm expecting a bit of pushback from this, unfortunately, but I'm really excited to see it out there. And I hope it's the sort of thing that other people working in this space might start to consider as well. So that just leaves me to say a big thank you to the people who have supported us. So this is some of my academic team. That dog in the middle lives in the accommodation that we stay in, and he's absolutely gorgeous. He's called Roy. Some of the communities, community groups that supported us are on screen there. That is by no means an exhaustive list. And before I finish, I just want to reflect on why I really wanted to give this talk, because I have had academics come and speak to me in ways that I think is quite frankly unacceptable about community integration into research, saying that the data cannot be trusted, saying that members of the community are problem makers, they've all got vested interests, complaining about interactions with community members after trespassing on land without the landowner's permission, as though the community was in the wrong, being told that social science data and data that engages with perspectives and experiences of community is not real data. And this has all happened by people working in the plastic pollution research community. And these are the kind of barriers that I am also in the process currently facing when I try and publish this work. Okay, so the paper that's gone into iScience, for example, one of the reviewer comments was that the social science data is interesting context, but not scientifically pertinent. And it's completely changed our interpretation of the data that we presented. But we've got other environmental researchers telling us that it's not data, that it doesn't count. And I think this is really holding people back in this space. And that is obviously particularly with a focus on communities in the kind of public definition, members of the public definition of the word. So yeah, I'm conscious of time. That's all I have to say. I'm happy to open the floor to questions.